welcome to another live stream for History Back podcast. Today, I'm joined by frequent guest of the channel, Dr. Robert Price, and today we're talking about his new book that just recently released, The Gospels Behind the Gospels. I have the Amazon link to purchase his book down there in the description below. That being said, welcome back to the podcast, Dr. Price.
Oh, it's great to be back, as always.
I'm also pleased to say that the GoFundMe went extraordinarily well. It made over $2,800, well beyond the goal. And I want to thank everybody that donated to the GoFundMe. I really appreciate all of you for chiming in to help Bob Price out in his difficult times.
Yeah, it makes so much difference. You have really helped Carol and myself. I cannot tell you how grateful I am, how touching your loyal support is.
Well, that being said, let's get right into it. So we already have 3 super chat questions before we even started. So let's get right into it. Constellation Pegasus, thank you for your super chat. Are pastors not liars? Never heard one in church or a kingdom hall tell the congregations they are proven forgeries.
Well, my guess is most clergy, especially conservative ones, have no idea about the critical issues with regard to any biblical writings. And if their preparation, their education in seminary dealt with this stuff at all, it was by way of apologetics, saying why these critics were wrong and nefarious and how their teaching was dangerous and you need not look into it for yourself. Here's why they're wrong before you even really know what they're saying. But then there are others that are more I guess the conservative evangelicals are the mainstream now with the shrinking of liberal Protestantism. But in the latter, those folks, it seems to me, are not really concerned with matters of biblical criticism and probably do not engage much in doctrinal preaching as conservatives do, in my sense, and that's all it is. I mean, I haven't taken surveys and all that, but my sense is that the mainline denominations, Methodists, Presbyterians, and so forth, really are not that interested in who wrote the books of the Bible and why and how reliable it all is, because they correctly see that these are not the matters to deal with Sunday morning. I mean, as you know, I'm all into this stuff, but during the years, about a dozen years where I was a pastor, I didn't preach on my theological beliefs, nor did I know where most of the people in my congregation were theologically. We also had study groups and so on during the week if anybody wanted to get into that. But Sunday morning, I figured my job was to exhort and comfort and stimulate thought and behavior, virtue, and so on. And I almost always would use some Bible passage as the launch pad for it. But to me, the sanctuary in a church is not a lecture hall. So that in a way, they don't really need to lie about what they may or may not believe about critical issues. It's just not their corner of the vineyard. And if they find value, wisdom in the Bible, which I certainly did and do, you're going to talk about that. It's just not really edifying for most people to who don't happen to be interested in this stuff to talk about critical issues. It's a whole different mind game. Now, there are some apparently who are sadly being trapped in a tight spot between a rock and a hard place. because they don't even believe in it anymore, which in any way, that they've become inside atheists or whatever, and but they have to protect that knowledge. They can't let it be known, because others who think it's more important than they would will persecute them or get them fired. That happens often. And so they can't really level with the people in the pews, though, as I've just said, I don't think there's much call to do that. And if you're just, there's an old joke, I'm sure I've bored you with it before, where like it was set in the Church of England, I guess in the 19th century or something, when there was a big vogue in Arian Christology, the idea that Jesus was the incarnation of the pre-existent Logos, but that didn't make him actually God, because the Logos, they believed, was a subordinate creation of God. As Jehovah's Witnesses still believe. Well, this after the sermon, the service is over one day, and the priest is shaking hands with the congregation as they depart. One little old lady says, "Father, come to think of it, I believe I have never heard you give a sermon on the Trinity." And the clergyman said, "And you never will." And apparently just dismissed it right there. I don't know if that even happened, but the joke does kind of tell you what the best position to be in if you don't believe in the Christian theology anymore. Just don't get into it. Do most people want theology lectures? I doubt it. Do most people care whether it was David who wrote Psalm 23 or somebody else? So often I think there's not a problem, but I know there is this thing called the Clergy Project that I believe the Freedom from Religion Foundation started with Dave Barker and others, where they've as I understand it, it exists to try to help clergy who now feel compromised and don't want to be hypocrites to get out of that line of work and into something else, perhaps social workers or therapists or something. If you feel like you really just don't belong in the pulpit anymore, it would be good to look elsewhere. But so I don't know how often that dilemma comes up, but a lot of people, they just don't get so far into it for them to be in danger of being hypocrites, because it's the story value and the moral value that they preach on and that their congregations want to hear. So they're not really compromised. Bultmann, who's he? They don't care about that stuff. And why should they? I mean, I don't tell anybody they ought to be Bible geeks like me. I mean, I don't think, you're obliged to know the Bible. No, there's no skin in the game in that sense. So you're not necessarily worse off if you don't happen to be interested in this. I am interested in it, so I pursue it, but I don't think anybody else is obliged to do it. So I've never really had that problem, and I don't know how many pastors do. I know some do, though, and I wish them luck.
Got another super chat from Constellation Pegasus again. Saw the Atheist for Liberty interview. Wasn't aware the far left cancel culture was doing damage. Most people really know how to show outrage and political correctness. They can create trouble and divide people anywhere.
Yeah, I think that is just not helpful, because it is dead end divisiveness. You're not accomplishing anything for your side if you're just condemning the other side. What's going to happen to those people, those who are your intellectual opponents? You're not going to convert them by this kind of treatment. Why not pursue constructive dialogue? Come, let us reason together. That will quickly show what common ground you may have with those who despise your views and so on. And they may despise them and you because they don't understand it. You may feel that way about them because you've adopted a caricature. I mean, there are real and really important differences, but it seems to me dialogue is possible and might be the solution to a lot of things. And but the cancel culture people are really just inquisitors. And I guess it makes them feel good, but I just don't see what real good it does.
He's got another one. Thanks again, Constellation Pegasus. He says, one last thing. Can you go over the Babylonian influence again? I smell big Persian influence about the Shadim after that. What was the big difference between the Pharisees and Sadducees? Just weird how they could coexist.
Well, there was an example where, despite their huge differences, they realized they had important common ground, namely worshiping God and watching out for their fellow Jews. And they would compromise with Rome in a kind of realpolitik. They knew that there were certain political and other compromises they would rather avoid, like paying taxes to Caesar. But what the heck? What's the alternative? And so when they had to form a united front with the Sadducees, they could and did. Usually the high priest was a Sadducee, but there were some Pharisees who were occasionally. And the big difference between the two is that the Pharisees, at least by the theory that I accept, were heavily Persianized, that they had embraced the kind of Judaized Zoroastrianism that was imposed upon them by the Persian imperial authorities and their Jewish agents like Ezra and Nehemiah. And this was, as you say, there was a heavy Persian element in there. The idea of a supernatural virgin-born Messiah who would appear at the end of the age to raise the dead so they'd face the music for the final judgment. The idea that there was an evil anti-God, Ahriman. And of course, these things moved over into Judaism. Satan had been God's prosecuting attorney and the master of sting operations to expose the wicked. Well, he becomes the chief wicked one once he gets morphed into the Persian Ahriman. And they had the idea that the dead would go to Sheol, and that wasn't a fiery hell. But the idea of resurrection of the righteous dead, that appears to have come from Zoroastrianism. You don't see it in pre-exilic parts of the Hebrew Bible. The idea of apocalyptic history, that you could chart out the events that must happen for the age to run its course and come to its prophesied end, that seems to have come from Persian Zoroastrianism. You don't find that in these earlier Jewish prophets. Rather, they have this kind of Deuteronomic view of history, that it's open-ended, and Jews have a covenant with God. If they keep the provisions of the Torah, God will keep watch over them and assure them prosperity and good health and good crops and victory in warfare. But if they don't, if they tire of that and become sloppy and corrupted by syncretism with idolatry and so on, well, then you can't expect God to watch out for you. You're not holding up your end of the deal. He's not going to hold up his. Nothing obliges him to. And so how is history going to come out? Well, we don't know. It's open-ended. It's really up to you. How are you, God's people, going to behave? That will determine whether it's weal or woe, and it may go back and forth between them. Will there be a final wrap-up? as far as I know, no biblical prophet like Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, and those guys, none of them saw it that way. They figured, oh, it may go on indefinitely. Let's just behave ourselves so it'll be a good ride. And now Sadducees, also angelology, the idea of there being ranks of angels serving God, maybe even as his troops and his army, that appears to come from Zoroastrianism. The angels of the Old Testament, the same word means messenger, and sometimes it's not absolutely clear whether they're supposed to be superhuman entities. So angelology as such looks like a post-exilic borrowing from Zoroastrianism. Now, the Sadducees apparently nicknamed the group of Jews influenced by Persia. They nicknamed them the Parsees or Pharisees, a slightly more elaborate pronunciation. And they were saying, are you guys even really Jews anymore? I mean, you sound Zoroastrian to me, so that's what we're going to call you, the Parsees. Well, naturally, they didn't take the Persianized Jews didn't like that much, so they redefined it. Okay, Pharisee, that's fine, but we hear that word and think it means separated ones. In other words, Puritans, basically, purified, because we're steering clear of sinners and sin. So Pharisees, sure, why not? I like it. Let's copyright it. But that's what we mean by it. But now, who were the Sadducees? They were... they claimed that their name was a kind of a Hellenized version of the Zadokites, the priesthood that David installed. That might work, but that seems also to be a redefinition. It seems more likely Sadducee is simply a slight variant on the Greek word for councilman. In other words, the syndikoi, Greek for councilmen, and that's what they were. They were the elders of Israel, the wealthy aristocracy who ran things, including the temple. And in fact, the temple was not nearly as important to the Pharisees, who really were a people of the book. I mean, their power base was in the synagogues, which were schools, basically, whereas the Sadducees were all about the ancient sacrificial rituals in the temple. Would there be an afterlife? Not necessarily. Were there such things as angels? We're told they didn't think so. Was there predestination, as the Pharisees taught? No, come on. And what about the oral tradition of the Pharisees? The Sadducees said, what are you talking about, this oral Torah? That's a lot of bunk. We just stick with the actual Tanakh, the written scripture. That's what God gave Moses, not all the superfluous verbiage you guys have added to it. And so they did have big differences. But, you know, they were... like if you were a Sadducee, you'd say, well, the Pharisees have a lot of crazy views, but, you know, can't deny they, like us, they worship the true God. They're zealous for the Torah. So sure, they're Jews. Sure. We just think they've kind of gone off the deep end. Now, Pharisees were less likely to be that charitable towards Sadducees. In the writings of the rabbis, they refer sometimes to the Sadducees, who weren't really around anymore after the destruction of the temple, but that kind of Jew as an Epicurean, because they were sort of stripped down philosophers started by Epicurus. They did not believe in an afterlife and so forth. Well, the Pharisees wondered if the Sadducees really were Jews, just like Orthodox Jews today say, you Reform Jews, I don't think you qualify. You deny more than you believe. You really have to be Orthodox or conservative for us to consider you Jews. I think it was kind of like that. So there were big differences, and yet they would work together if they had to. And that's more than you can say about some Americans now.
All right. Constellation Vegas says, thank you for another super chat. I plan on buying the book. I was always interested in the Apollo sky. Reminds me of an Apollo command and service module pilot heats ago, but not now.
Apollo command. What is that from science fiction, you mean, or of the Apollo moon launch?
I think he was talking about the Apollo moon missions.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Well, let's see. I'm almost forgetting what.
He's trying to make a joke. He's saying that the Apollos that Paul was talking about is like the Apollos mission, the Apollo mission to the moon.
Well, he was an allegorizer, apparently, and some would say that's kind of high flying. But Apollos is really a fascinating character, all the more fascinating since we're told so little about it, but it's so tantalizing. We're told that he came from Alexandria, that he was well versed in the scriptures, that he somehow knew about the preaching of John the Baptist, though not about Jesus until he was educated by Priscilla and Aquila, who said, you're on the right track, but there's something you're missing that you must not have heard of down there. The guy that Paul says this to a bunch of guys who were probably disciples of Apollos in Ephesus. He said, the guy that John was telling people to expect, he came. That was Jesus. So really, you guys need to be baptized in his name. So Apollos is pictured similarly as a kind of a half Christian, but it also says he taught the things concerning Jesus correctly. Well, apparently not too correctly, because he had to be coached later. So it's not that clear, but it almost sounds to me like he is a fictitious Christian version of Philo. And in fact, some early Christians thought Philo was a Christian, and that the Therapeutai sect that he praised were already Christians. For some reason, Eusebius had the idea that Philo had gone to Rome to meet with Simon Peter. I don't know if there's any reason to believe that, but it's kind of striking that any official Christians like Eusebius, who was no fringe eccentric, believed that. So I kind of wonder if he's really supposed to be Philo, because in Philo's writings, he comes pretty darn close to the Christology of Paul, John, and the letter to the Hebrews. But in the Gospels behind the Gospels, I speculate, and believe me, I know that's all it is. Can't prove this. I suspect that Apollos is really a Christianized, but fictively, like that he's it's a version of Apollonius of Tyana. Not that he actually was a Christian. Of course, he was not. If he actually existed, which I'm not absolutely convinced of, he was a Neo-Pythagorean, an itinerant preacher of that ascetical philosophy. And in the Western manuscript of Acts, he is not called Apollos, but the full version of the name Apollonius, and in the what do you call it, the mainstream text, Sinaiticus, Vaticanus, and those there, it's just Apollos, and so virtually all English translations follow that, but it almost doesn't matter. It is a short form of Apollonius. Now, here's a couple of things that may mean nothing, but they're intriguing. Apollonius, well, he was very much like a Jesus figure in the one text we have about him, written in the 3rd century, that is the 200s CE, by Flavius Philostratus, who was commissioned by the empress to write a biography of Apollonius, whom she revered. And so it comes out very much like the New Testament Gospels, only much longer. But Apollonius is a wandering preacher. He does miracles. He casts out demons. And he is finally brought before the Roman emperor to be judged, and vanishes out of the imperial court and teleports across the whole darn Mediterranean into Asia Minor, where he had earlier sent his disciple Damas back to comfort the rest of his disciples there. Well, he then appears among them in Asia Minor, where they're all gathered together, and they can't believe their eyes. They said, "We've given you up for dead. We thought surely you must have been judged and executed." And he said, "Nah." And he shows them. Well, and they say, "Well, how did you just pop into being here? Are you a ghost?" And he said, No. You see, and he shows them his hands and feet. He says, "Touch me, take hold and see that I am not a spirit ascended from the realm of Persephone to comfort you." It's just like Luke 24, right? And so now they realize that Apollonius is, hardly a mere human at all. And the whole thing is so much like Jesus, but also like Paul, because in the pastorals, we read how Paul had disciples who had abandoned him, including one named Demas, who has left him and gone back east. Now, wait a second, that rings a bell. Apollonius had a disciple named Damas, whom he sent back east. Also, part of Apollonius's itinerary going west in Asia Minor, today's Turkey, is a series of the same cities. Acts has Paul visiting in the same order, though it doesn't really say what he did there. And let's see. There's something else I'm missing about Apollonius. Oh, yeah. He is said to have spent a brief time in Corinth. Well, when you read in 1 Corinthians that it's implied that these figureheads of Paul, Christ, I'm going to get into that in a minute, Cephas and Apollos had been there, and each had his own faction once he left. So that Apollos must have visited Corinth. I think Acts also says he did. He went from Ephesus to Corinth. And Apollonius went to Corinth. I admit that's not much of a thumb on the scale, but it really does make you have to wonder. Apollonius, some people have said, I think Apollonius was Paul. Others have said, I think Apollonius was Jesus. There's not much basis for that one, but it's just that they have biographies in the same genre. They're both aretalogies, as they're called, accounts of their many wonders that they worked. So that's more than you wanted to know, I'm sure. But you press the button and the whole thing spills out, I'm afraid.
So let's talk about your book, the Gospels Behind the Gospels. What is different about this book compared to the ones you've written before from your point of view? And does it talk about sources behind the Gospels, or do you mean something else by that title?
No, that is what I mean, and that's the big difference. There are parallels between Jesus and Moses, Elijah and Elisha, John the Baptist, and so on. that everybody admits, this makes Jesus look kind of like this one or that one. And some people have hypothesized that maybe those were early opinions about Jesus that different factions held. I've long thought that about the confession of Peter scene, right, where Jesus says, "Who do men say that I am?" Because the disciples are closer to the crowds and they will overhear things Jesus doesn't. And they say, well, some say that you're Elijah returned, or one of the other prophets. And in John's gospel, they narrow that down to the prophet, meaning the prophet like Moses, shorthand. Some say you're John the Baptist resurrected from the dead. And Jesus says, well, how about you? What do you think? And Peter says, well, you're the Christ, or the Christ of God, or the Christ, the Son of the living God, or whatever. But I've long suspected that Mark, whoever he was inserting that in order to combat current Christologies that he thought were heretical. That is, that he knew of groups who were big Jesus fans, but didn't think of him as the Jewish Messiah. They thought, oh, this is the prophet like Moses that was predicted in Deuteronomy. Or, hey, we were expecting Elijah. This must be him. Or, did I hear that John the Baptist, after being killed by a tyrant, is back and he's doing miracles because he's resurrected? Well, it must be John. And Mark is at pains to say, no, all of those are wrong. Of course, they might have their own version where Jesus asks, who do you say that I am? And they say, some say Elijah, some say John the Baptist, some say the Messiah. Yeah, but how about you? Oh, well, we know you're John the Baptist. Ah, yes. I mean, who knows? They may have their own versions of that. Well, what's distinctive about what I'm doing is the source critical angle, because I am experimenting with the idea that there are not simply isolated traditions that the gospel writers gathered from wherever and put them in, miracle, multiplying the loaves and fish. That's kind of like Elijah. Maybe Jesus did it too, and things like that. That I'm suggesting that perhaps these different types of Jesus groups, what's his name? Oh, good God, snap out of it, Price. The guy that wrote The Myth of Innocence, Burton Mack, he called them Jesus movements and Christ cults, different groups that eventually merged together once they had begun to run out of gas and out of members. Well, let's consolidate and save what's left. Well, my idea is that these people, while they were different sects, had their own source of stories and sayings of Jesus. Maybe oral, maybe written. The same ambiguity people have about the Q source. A lot of debates, I guess it's still going on. Was this a memorized set of sayings, or did they actually have written versions of it? I don't know. I'm guessing it's written, but nonetheless, what I'm saying is that there were analogous source books or whatever, where compiled by people who thought Jesus was the returned Elijah / Elisha, because they're almost the same character anyway, or the prophet like Moses, or even Moses returned, which some Samaritans thought, or that he was John the Baptist raised from the dead, and so forth, or a revolutionary king. Cut from the cloth of a messianic prophecy and so forth, and there were other options too, and so that once these became defunct, their collections of materials were still available and were employed by the four gospel writers to combine under the umbrella of their favorite Christologies. And this resulted in the oddity that all the gospels seem to have different views of Jesus, who and what he was, indiscriminately mixed together despite their incompatibility. Like, why is Jesus depicted as a healer and virtually a magician and a would-be Messiah and somebody like John the Baptist and a new Moses and so forth and so on? Now, you might be able to combine a couple of these, but was Jesus all of these things like you have in Crossan's book, The Historical Jesus? It's like anything anybody has ever said about Jesus, Crossan feels like he can combine into one many-headed Jesus, like the Hydra. Well, that's kind of what the Gospels are already doing. And so I'm saying, let's see if we could extract all of that stuff and segregate them under the aegis of these different rival Jesus concepts. Well, what do you know? It kind of looks like you can. For instance, there are three versions of a miracle chain, as Paul Ochtmeyer called it, a miracle catena, where you have two of them, two versions in Mark. You have a sea miracle, stilling the storm, walking on the water, in both of these. And in the Gospel of Signs, one of the sources of John's Gospel, you got the walking on the water at least. Then Jesus does a miracle of an ill child of a Gentile. It's the Syrophoenician woman in one place in Mark. It's Jairus's daughter in another place in Mark. You've got the feeding miracles. There are two of those in Mark. Also in Matthew, Luke has only one, and so does John. Then you have, I forget what the other ones are, maybe the healing of the blind and exorcisms or something. But Ochtmeyer, I think, was right. It looks like you had a series of miracle stories that were all told in some kind of sequence. Now, they might get flipped around a little bit, and they have once they were put into the Gospels, but that doesn't sound like a coincidence. Well, what would that imply about Jesus? It's interesting that at the end of the Gospel of John, it says, now Jesus did lots of other things here, but I've only selected these. So that you may know that he's the Son of God, the Messiah, and have life in his name. Well, wait a minute. These things were not expected of the Messiah. What were they attesting? Well, they all mirror things that Elijah and Elisha did. So doesn't that make sense if those miracle stories were compiled by somebody that thought he was Elijah / Elisha returned? Luke has other material like that. He contrasts the calling of Levi, Peter, Andrew, James, and John, who just drop everything and follow him. He contrasts that with the calling of Levi. I'm sorry, Levi and those four. They're in Mark and Luke, but in First Kings, Elijah recruits Elisha, and he drops everything and follows him and becomes his successor. Elijah gives them a break. He says, okay, I'll give you time to go say goodbye to your parents and settle your affairs, but then let's hit the road. But in the Christian version, when they asked for a break to settle their affairs, he says, hey, look, let the dead bury their dead. You don't put your hand to the plow and then turn back. You make this commitment, you're ready to go right now. It's like he's saying, you see, he's like Elijah, but better. Or similarly, when Jesus and his disciples want to stop for the night in Samaria, when the people, the innkeepers, etc., hear, you guys are going to Jerusalem? That bunch of heretics, get the hell out of here. And James and John are really steamed at this. And they say to Jesus, those Samaritan bastards, Lord, do you want us to call down fire from heaven on them as Elijah did? And Jesus says, you don't know what spirit you belong to. The Son of Man came to save men's lives, not to destroy them. So the contrast is drawn by way of a comparison. Yeah, he's like a new Elijah, but better. He has mercy on people. And there's stuff like that. Or how about the prophet like Moses? Why do you suppose that you have the transfiguration story where Jesus goes up to the top of a mountain, and in Mark, his clothing glows. In Matthew, his clothing and his countenance glows. Well, that's kind of like Moses, isn't it? He goes to the top of the mountain to receive the commandments. He goes into the tent of meeting to get more commandments. And when he emerges, his face shines like the sun. Well, that's already a new Moses gimmick. But why do you suppose Matthew felt the need to organize the teachings of Jesus into 5 big blocks of sayings, each one capped off by pretty much the same thing? When he finished these sayings, he went on from there. Every one of them. What are the 5? Well, there's the Sermon on the Mount in chapter 5 through 7. There is the collection of parables in chapter 12. Then there is the church, what we call it, the manual of discipline in chapters 18 and 19. And chapter 10 I left out. That's the mission charge to go preach the kingdom of God and the rules to follow as you do so. Skipping back over to the 5th, that's chapters 24 through, I guess, 26. It's 23 and following. First, the denunciation of the Pharisees, and then the apocalyptic discourse derived from Mark 13, but with a lot added. Those are 2 different subjects, aren't they? Denouncing the Pharisees and predicting the end of the age. Well, yeah. Why did he cram them together when they don't match subject-wise? Because he had to get them into 5. Right? He wants a Jesus Pentateuch, even if he has to cheat to make it fit. Similarly, in Luke, the whole central section of Luke, that is also the travel narrative, when he makes the final trip from Galilee, I think through Perea down to Jerusalem. It's like it would take him. It seems to take him 3 weeks, whereas it wouldn't ordinarily. It's a literary device. And why? What is the material that's grouped in there? C.F. Evans long ago showed that the whole thing is a new Deuteronomy, that every one of the sayings of Jesus corresponds in virtually every case in the same order to a bit of Deuteronomy. It doesn't necessarily say the same thing. Sometimes it critiques what Deuteronomy had on the same topic. Sometimes it's simply the same topic, but something much different is said. But it cannot be an accident. Why? Who would put together, of all things, a Deuteronomy? Well, somebody who thought Jesus was the Deutero-Moses. Otherwise, to me, it's inexplicable. So this stuff must survive from a Jesus sect that saw him not as the Messiah, but as Moses returned or a new Moses. John the Baptist, again, there are loads of parallels there. The martyr analogy, a nativity story, his running afoul of an official whose wife maneuvers him into killing the prophet, Pilate's wife, Herodias, and so on. And then there are various sayings about John the Baptist that appear to fit John partisanship rather than Jesus. Like from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of God has advanced violently, and violent men take it by force. Well, that kind of implies John started the revolutionary ball rolling. Or another one, the law and the prophets were until John. What does that mean? Doesn't it kind of imply John is the climactic fulfillment of biblical prophecy, not Jesus? Saying that the disciples of John would have circulated. Or how about, of men born of women, no greater has ever arisen than John the Baptist. Who's going to say that? Right? Of course, Christians, in order to use that, had to negate it with a proviso, right? They tacked on, nonetheless, even the lowest schmo in the kingdom of God is greater than he. Come on, nobody would say that, I think, anyway. And so it looks like they were using John the Baptist material in the sect of John the Baptist. And when you hear twice in Mark that the crowd and Herod Antipas hear about John's miracles, they say, gee, it seems to me I beheaded this guy. He must have been raised from the dead to have such powers at work in him. Well, I can't help thinking of Romans chapter 1, verses 3 and 4. According to the flesh, he was of the seed of David, but by the Spirit of holiness, he was declared Son of God in an act of power via the resurrection from the dead. You got these same elements. Resurrected, therefore powers are at work in him, and he is the Son of God, or at least some kind of transfigured being. I think you've got the resurrection charismas of the John sect and the Jesus sect, or maybe even the Jesus is John sect. So there's other stuff. I won't even go into the loose ends that combine to suggest that Jesus was a revolutionary Messiah. Again, there is other material in there too. Also, though, I think that is a different way of organizing the material and a new approach to source criticism. Of course, I'm not betting my life that that's what happened. It just seems to me that would make a lot of sense if it was what happened. And finally, let me just say one other thing and I'll be quiet. An unusual feature beyond even that is the last chapter, where I say there's some strangely similar kind of a thing going on in 1 Corinthians. The passage where Paul says, I hear, my brethren, there are divisions among you, and I halfway believe it, because what I'm hearing is one of you says, I am of Paul, another, I am of Cephas, another, I am of Apollos, and finally, I am of Christ. Wait a second. How can he place Christ on the same shelf with Cephas, presumably Peter, who knows, and Apollos, and Paul. The only sense this makes to me, and I've heard various explanations that seem special pleading. The only sense it makes to me is that this is a little fragment from a time when Christ, Paul, Apollos, and Peter or Cephas was each an equivalent religious figurehead, that different similar groups revered each of these guys as their founding saint. Well, eventually, again, they began to shrink. And eventually they decided, well, we will last longer together than separate. So what the heck, let's combine. Now, who's going to be the main figurehead? Well, presumably the most numerous one, and that would have been the Christians, right? But the Paulinists had considered Paul to be their savior, and there are bits of evidence that point to that, even in the New Testament. Remember in Colossians, where Paul says, hey, you've heard about my sufferings, don't worry about that. All I'm doing is, by my sufferings, fulfilling what is still lacking in the sufferings of Christ on behalf of the church. What? Did I hear that right? Let me get this straight. Paul's suffering is redemptive, and it fills up what was lacking in the sufferings of Christ. Well, that was a way of saying he does have a role in this. It's kind of similar to where Catholics call Mary the co-redemptrix and so forth. With Cephas, we've in Acts already, we've got what amounts to a passion and resurrection narrative of Peter in chapter 12, where Herod Agrippa I puts him on death row to get his head chopped off the next day. An angel rescues him and leaves the guards behind, and he goes to his fans to tell them it's really me, and they say, oh no, I can't believe it. I know it is really, but I better scram now. I'm a wanted man. Go and tell James. That's very much like the Matthean version of Jesus' passion. They just told the same thing about him. With Paul, there's the Nag Hammadi book called The Revelation of Paul, in which Paul has his heavenly journey and has to fight his way through the archons and then fight the demiurge. The name Jesus is never mentioned in this document. Paul is the savior. And on it goes. Now, as I've already said, it might be that Apollos is Apollonius of Tyana, and they have Christianized him. And I've told you the tiny reasons why that is, but it makes sense to me. Now, again, it is speculation. You can't prove it, but that is at least the new thing in my book. You're not going to find any of that stuff anywhere else, and I believe I am arguing in a scholarly, responsible way.
Let's take one more super chat before we close. Constellation Vegas is again paying for your super chat. Can you tell us about this Lord of the Flies, Belzibar stuff? I remember you going into it years ago, but can't remember.
Oh yeah, this is so fascinating. Jesus, in the King James Version, when Jesus' competitors and critics are trying to laugh off his exorcisms, saying this is all a scam. It's just black magic. You know how he casts out these demons? Because he's in league with their chief, Beelzebub. That's not what it says. In the earliest manuscript, it says he's in league with Beelzebul. Easy mistake to make. So who were these guys? Well, Beelzebub, or Baal-zebub, just different consonants. That was negligible in Hebrew anyway. I'm sorry, different vowel points. Baal-zebub was the oracle god of the Philistines at one of their chief cities, Ekron. And we read about them in the first chapter of Second Kings, where I think it's King Ahaziah falls through the rotten wood of a trellis in his palace and is severely injured. And he says, am I going to survive this? I may not. The doctors don't know what to tell me. And so, hey, come over here. And he sends one of his men to Ekron, which isn't that far away, right? Just on the coast, really. And he says, ask him, am I going to heal up from this disease and rise from my sick bed? And you bet, Chief. And he leaves, but he comes back early. And the king says, you're back already? How did it happen so fast? He said, well, actually, I didn't make the whole trip. I got stopped midway by this weird looking guy who told me these words. What, is there no prophet in Israel that you got to get your fortune told with a Philistine oracle? Well, I'll save you the trouble. I can tell you right now, your master is a dead man. Tell him that for me. He tells this to the king, and the king says, what did this guy look like? Oh, he was a hairy man, which some translate as he's wearing a camel's hair tunic or something. But this is enough for the king to say, oh my God, it's Elijah the Tishbite. He knows that the prophecy is going to come true and his days are numbered. And there's even the implication that had he actually asked Elijah about his master's fate, he might have been healed, but no, he's getting punished. Beelzebul is a different being altogether. He is a later combination of two other gods. One was named Baal Mul Lil, who was a lord of demons, like the plague-spreading demons. And the other one was Baal Zebul, which means Lord of the House. I'm sorry, I skipped the thing you wanted to know. Beelzebub means Lord of the Flies, because the oracle would, like all of them in the ancient world, you'd ask your question and they'd go into a kind of a trance and begin to hear buzzing in their ears that sounded like the buzzing of a fly. And then they would be in a receptive mood and somehow decode the buzzing into the answer to your question. This is mentioned in other ancient sources. So that was Beelzebub, Lord of the Flies, which meant an oracle, right? Nothing to do with the famous novel. Okay, Baal or Beelzebul means Lord of the House, implying Lord of the world, the inhabited world. And he specifically was an exorcist god. He would, if you could get him in your power, you could force him to cough up his victims and set them free, because until they did, they're, like in the Gospels, they're foaming at the mouth, having epileptic fits, they're hysterically blind or deaf or mute or whatever, a super high fever. That meant they were demon possessed, right? So if you could get Beelzebul in your power, you could force him to free him. Hey, look, don't give me any back talk. I did the ritual. I bound you by the name of the angel so-and-so. You got to do what I ask. Okay, damn it. And he goes off and lets him go. Well, this is what exorcists did. And this is what Jesus actually is defending, right? If you look at the parts of the Q version in Matthew and Luke and Mark's version, Because each has a different intro. But if you look at the common shank of the thing, what you have is Jesus saying, no one can despoil a strong man of his property unless he binds the strong man first. And then he'll have to watch helplessly as the burglar steals all of his goods. Don't you see? And the idea being that I have bound the strong man, the chief of the demons, and therefore I haven't made a deal with him. I'm forcing him by holy power to give up his mastery of these poor sufferers, his victims. And they all do that. That's what he means by saying, look, if I'm casting out demons by Beelzebul, whom do your sons cast them out by? Let them be your judges. I think that implies that's what they do too. Surely you know that. That's what all exorcists did. But the evangelists have to add on to that, but for the same reason Matthew and Luke cut two of Mark's stories where Jesus uses these weird magical faith healing techniques, right? Spitting on the tongue of the mute so that he can now, cat got your tongue? Yeah, tongue tied? Well, let's see if we can lubricate it and untie it and he can speak. Or, oh, you're deaf. Well, Jesus puts his fingers in the ears of the deaf and says, be opened. It's like imitative magic, right? There's an occlusion in your ears. Who knows what it was? But it's like the finger, we're pulling out the occlusions and so on. Making clay to smear on the eye of the blind. Now go wash it off. You're washing off the blindness by means of imitative magic. Well, the later evangelists didn't like that. I mean, that's like the fact that Jesus was healing, but look, he's not some conjurer, as a lot of people thought. I mean, Jewish opponents and Celsus said the guy was a conjurer, that's all. Even one early Christian relic, a golden bowl, glass bowl with gold stuff etched on it, shows Jesus resurrecting Lazarus using a magic wand, right? But later evangelists, they didn't like this. No, look, he could do that stuff by a word. He's the Son of God. He doesn't need any angel, any demon, no nothing. So it's just a slander when they say he's in league with Beelzebul, as if he were Anton LaVey or Aleister Crowley or something. That is the idea. Beelzebub, the Ekronite oracle god, Baal Molil, the demon king, and Belzebul, lord of the inhabited world, including the demons. So that's, again, probably more than you wanted to hear, but I feel like I'm cheating you otherwise. So there we
go. We got a couple more super chats. Let's take those before we head off. Jordan Bickett, thank you for your super chat. As an amateur Bible geek, I have Greek New Testament and a 101 textbook for New Testament Greek. Should I bother taking up this new hobby? Is it worth it?
I think you can get along without it, but if you're inclined to do it, I would. It really is interesting being able to look up something in the Greek and maybe see something new that no translation you've seen has caught. I've had that happen, and it's quite fascinating. This is insignificant, but it might be a good example. When I was translating my pre-Nicene New Testament, and I was at the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus says, so-and-so is a fool, I had no idea that the Greek word there is moros, which is simply anglicized as moron. And so I decided, well, that's what I'm going to put. Imagine the moron that does this. And there are other things like that too. Or how about when in Matthew 18, I think it is, the unmerciful servant, when the king forgives him this huge debt. You'll never be able to pay it. Just forget it. Get out of here. And then he comes and finds some guy that owes him a couple of bucks and is not willing to show him the same clemency, but has him thrown into debtor's prison. Well, somebody tells the king this, and he says, bring that jerk back in here. And he says, you wouldn't forgive him that crummy little sum when I forgave you this fortune? Well, forget what I said. And it says his master handed him over to what? The jailers? No, the torturers, in Greek. Sometimes they're kind of masking things. And it's at least fun to see for yourself. So I would say if you're willing and have the time, that's an excellent idea.
Got one more super chat. Christopher Malloy, thank you for your super chat. Was Kapharism Marcionite in any way?
I don't think so. It was more like a form of Manichaeanism, though that did have some resemblance to Marcionite theology, but the Manichaeans were more overtly Gnostic than the Marcionites were. And that survived on into medieval Manichaeism, and which is another name for Catharism. And so they were. So I'd say they were more like Manichaeans and Gnostics, though they probably had more in common with Marcionites than they did with the Catholics of their day.
All right. Well, thanks for joining me today, Dr. Price.
Oh, it's great fun as always. What's more fun than shooting your mouth off? I know nothing.
Well, I thank everybody for super chatting their questions tonight, and I'll see everybody later.
Okay.
All right.
Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.